Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, and welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. I would like to warmly welcome our guest speakers today, Dr. Varsha. She is the author of Apples and Oranges and founder at Let's Drive, a proponent of cognitive diversity and total inclusion. Also with us today, Rajeev Menon, co-author of Apples and Oranges and DE&I proponent, human capital measurement and development, and also sales and product strategy, experience and innovation, cognitive diversity, and total inclusion. Welcome, Rajeev, and welcome, Dr. Varsha. It's great to have you both with us today.
Thank you, Rachel.
And Dr. Varsha is also, as I mentioned, the founder of Let's Drive, a company that is driving cognitive diversity and inclusion. Unlike traditional outsourcing, they provide extraordinary value to their customers, whether it's by creating awareness about the difference they bring to the table or enabling them to practice inclusive mindset within in-house workshops and academy. Let's Drive is led by a purpose to make an impact that matters, to enable corporations to experience real business impact of diverse thinking. And that brings us to, well, welcome both of you. And today we're going to be talking about cognitive diversity and some examples of frameworks and actionable insights to help our listeners today, or our audience today, kind of think about diversity and how to create action around some of what their purpose, and how to create actionable or intentions to implement and to drive greater inclusion in their organizations, their teams. And so before we dive into our discussion, Dr. Varsha, can you share a little bit about your background and how you came about your authoring the book with Rajeev, Apples and Oranges?
Yeah, I'm to keep my introduction brief. I always say I'm a psychologist and just leave it at that. But well, I've been in the assessment space for about 15 years now, and I enjoy creating assessments, especially those to measure personality and behavior. And with so much talk around diversity and inclusion, I really wanted to create an assessment that could help measure inclusion itself. How inclusive do I feel, and what kind of inclusivity do I extend to others? Right. So that's how this whole thing started. Even Let's Drive, and then while we went through the journey of trying to evangelize this concept, we realized that we need to write a book, because there are a lot of things, actionable steps and information that needs to be conveyed to organizations, and there should be a repository of all of this. And that's why we wrote Apples and Oranges. I guess that would be my background in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha. That's very helpful. And Rajeev, can you also share a little bit about your background and what drives your passion?
Sure, sure. So I have I wouldn't call a similar background, but a slightly different background, but associated with the same area, which is human capital measurement. I started off my career in this area, in the department of sales and market development. And over a period of time, I got into assessment creation. I got fascinated by how we could measure human capital in an unobfuscated way. And while we were doing that, and as Varsha said, we interact with a lot of organizations in the process of identifying assessments that can be used. We found out that one area that everyone's talking about but not doing much about in a sustainable way is this area of diversity and inclusion, right? And that's when we decided that one of the ways which we can reach out to more people in a structured way, in a process driven way, is by writing a handbook which people can refer to on their journey of improving diversity and inclusion at the workplace. And we'll talk a little more about it obviously during this podcast. But the key motivation was we wanted one single repository which contained anecdotal information, frameworks, theories about how you could go about building diversity and inclusion, which is a very, very important business prerogative today. And that's how we wrote the book.
That's fantastic, and that I think thank you for sharing a little bit about your background and kind of teeing us up here for our discussion. And my first question I have for Dr. Varsha is around, what are some of the common failure points or pitfalls that leaders and organizations fall into during DE&I implementation? We're seeing from Brighton Hallgroup's research that a lot of companies are saying they're focused on DE&I, but not enough companies are still kind of at that strategy level, and if they are offering some type of diversity training, more than half of organizations are still reporting that it's not that effective. So why, from what you see, what efforts are not working and why not?
Yeah. So I think the most important pitfall, from the way I see it, is looking at D&I as a social obligation rather than a genuine need to bring about a cultural change driven with passion. So I think really a lack of passion towards this initiative is one key thing. And that really, even in evolved organizations, we see that the first step um, these organizations take is to start with onboarding minority groups rather than spreading awareness on D&I or even preparing their organization and people for an inclusive culture. Now, what this leads to is too much focus on diversity and not so much on inclusion, and therefore focus on numbers and policies, etc., and not really um, an awareness, which is really the first step in this process, right? And we also see a lot of focus on the end result and not so much on the process. Let me give you an example. Say an organization would say the end goal is about let's have 25% of a particular minority group on board before the end of next uh, financial year or something like that. But how are you going to make those 25 percentage of people be heard, be seen, be represented in the true sense? So there is no real focus on the process, but too much on the end result. And there are a lot of other pitfalls that I could really list. It could be a fear of change. To bring in such a huge cultural change is not a simple task, and that could be very daunting, could be overwhelming, and it definitely involves a bit of a tough conversation. So I think that's exactly why some organizations even fail to embark on this journey. And then there is a lack of accountability for DE&I initiatives, um, and an inability to create champions of DE&I within the organization. And another key important point I'd like to make is, I think organizations, at least some of them, fail to see the connection between DI initiatives and business outcomes or profits. So these are really the pitfalls that I would say, but the efforts really don't work because they are focused on superficial inclusiveness, propagating superficial inclusiveness without really, understanding true inclusion. Say, for example, there is a lot of focus on celebrating special days like Women's Day or the Pride Month. But then after that special day or the month is over, there's really no actual measurable change in the culture. There is no real outcome, right? So I think a basic lack of understanding what DNI or diversity and inclusion really is, you know, is the real problem for all these pitfalls and common failure points. Um, and I would want to give an example here again. So there's this organization which advertises, or within the organization in the office, they have a board that says the average age of their employees is, say, 24.5 years. Now, what is the message that this organization is trying to give to its employees? Is it that you don't, so those who don't belong to this age range are, don't belong to the organization, or they need to fit in? So these kind of messages that organizations try to convey without really, intending any harm, sometimes can work against them. And I think that's where I would lay a lot of emphasis on really creating an awareness on diversity and inclusion, and preparing the people for an inclusive culture.
And it's interesting because the more that we try to be inclusive, right, or more that we try to pay attention to diversity in our organization, and sometimes by celebrating, a specific, ethnicity group, you are still excluding a lot of other groups that may not, let's say your organization starts with like an ERG group for Asians or ERG group for African Americans. Well, what about 50% of the other ethnicities in your company? And you just can't, there's just not enough time in a day for a company to pay attention to every different ethnicity. So by calling out just certain ones, you're not realizing how you're excluding other groups. So that is a challenge in itself. So there has to be a better way that we can embrace diversity without being so specific across different ethnicities, right? Or groups, depending on how you call it, even without getting into the particulars. I think, we've gotten to such an extent to having to celebrate so many different days for so many different things that by doing this, I think we're creating more exclusion.
True. I think you brought up a great point there when you said some people would feel excluded when you celebrate certain other things. So even the so-called dominating group, the white male, also needs to be part of this inclusive journey, also needs to be part of the inclusive culture, and definitely that group would add to the cognitive diversity that we speak about so much in our book.
Right. And so, um, and my next question is to Rajiv. How can the current approach to DE&I in corporations be made better? Dr. Varsha kind of gave us a great starting point here, and how we really should think about some of the challenges with some of the approaches that we need to really think about.
Right. And I think both of you brought out some very important points as far as what the key pitfalls have been in the journey so far. And by far, it's not been, while there's a lot of advancement in this entire topic, we know that we are 6 decades of work in D&I actually not led to the kind of benefits that, or the impact that we thought of, or people might have thought of when they started off. To me, I think the issue really is with the fact that the number one issue is that there is still not enough conviction at the topmost level, at the leadership level, that diversity is something that impacts business positively. It seems to be a way to respond to people's feelings and the public's feelings about including minority groups, rather than actually figuring out that diversity improves the business performance significantly. And there are tomes written on how diverse thinking helps faster innovation, better problem solving, and so on and so forth. So that conviction has to come in, that this is something that we need for growth of the company itself. The second is, I mean, it's and just before going to the second point, another point is, it's not just about race or gender, right? It's about looking at diversity from the prism of cognitive diversity. We are having diversity because different people from different cultures can bring different viewpoints in, not because they're physiologically different. Because if I'm looking at it from a pure corporate perspective, I'm looking at saying that what can improve my top line, what can improve my bottom line, what can give me better competitive advantage, how can my customers, more of my customers buy more of my products. The second point, once the leaders are convinced, is to create awareness. So if you go around asking employees today, why do you need diversity? Is it something that is important for you? And everyone will just point out to the fact that, hey, this is something that HR does. HR has these, let's say, 8 events in a year where it's a Hispanic diversity or an Afro American diversity, or let's say an Indian diversity, whatever it is. And we just celebrate that one day as a special day. We do some fancy stuff, and that's about it. Do people at the lower ranks of the organization also realize that they can benefit a lot, that their work can get impacted positively by having different people with different viewpoints, different thought processes coming in? The answer is no. So to do that, you need to do training sessions, which there is an increased amount of training sessions happening. The second is to do open house, town halls, be transparent about why you want to do diversity. The third is to demonstrate. You need to be able to demonstrate right from the very top, in terms of meetings, in terms of representation, in terms of, for example, a company that I work closely with ensured that every town hall was led by a different leader, a different person. It could be someone from a different background, someone from a different gender, etc. That gave an impression to the rest of the organization, that hey, diversity is celebrated here in this organization. That did help push the message through a little bit. The fourth, as Dr. Varsha articulated, is about measurement. Where are we on that today? What kind of teams do you have today? Do you have the diverse thinking that is required for improving innovation? Is there a way to formally measure it? And we discuss a lot about how it can be measured in the book. Once you've measured, you've identified the gaps, implement specific actions, not just in terms of saying that, hey, I want to hire more people from a different diverse background and stuff like that, but also in terms of saying, how can this get woven into the performance framework? How can this get into the KPIs? How can this get into the OKRs and so on and so forth? Because at the end of it, if you don't put this in the right place where it really matters, no one is going to even look at it. It's like something that they have to do just like that. Next is to review and keep reviewing, make changes, move forward, increase the pace. In many cases, you might have to do it at different pace of work. In some cases, you might the awareness is so high that you can go in to a diversity and inclusion culture in a very strong way. For others, it could be slower. The awareness phase itself might take much longer period of time. And if ultimately, if people don't realize that, if you don't move away from the physiological diversity that people are today talking about, and go into the reasons of what the physiological diversity actually brings it onto the table, which is cognitive diversity, the chances are that these initiatives will not go forward in a much in a way that will create the maximum impact. To kind of top it off, I would just say three things. Start with representation, because that's the easiest way. I'm not against getting people from multiple representations into the organization. You need to have that's the easier thing for recruitment to do, or easier thing for an organization to do, is to get people with multiple backgrounds into the organization. This can happen through quota systems. This can happen through any specific mandates. Second, and the most important part, is when you get in people through these mandates, you need to be able to do something very important, which is, how do you bring those people up to the table to have a conversation across the table with someone who has been the majority class for such a long time? Are there programs to upskill? Are there meeting etiquettes that need to be followed to ensure that people who are from a different background, or different thinking process, have their voice at the table? And third, talk about more about that over a period of time. Move the conversation completely into talking about cognitive diversity and not about physiological diversity. If corporates can take these steps, there's still a good chance that you might be able to progress well ahead on the diversity topic, and you will have diverse workforce giving you the right kind of dividends that people have always been talking about, but never have realized. So this is rather our theory from what we have interacted with multiple customers, multiple people across various sectors. This is what we think would work, and we have discussed a lot of this in our book Apples and Oranges at length.
And When you consider diversity, it is quite different in organizations depending on the type of industry, the location, the maturity of the organization. When we talk to, Brandon Hall Group is a research firm that's focused on human capital management. And so, I've been in the learning industry. We started there first and kind of evolved over the years to incorporate all aspects of how you develop people, how you onboard people, how you recruit people. And really, it was kind of based on the industry where you can't do one of these without kind of doing the other, and make sure they're all integrated well. And so when we look at learning, it's interesting, a lot of the same thought process, going back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even though we have different tools and different resources and approaches, but it's still kind of around the same mindset about engagement, about learning outcomes, about impact. But when you talk to companies about diversity, everyone's kind of at um, I think, stage or phase, and how they think about it, how they approach it, and how they bring awareness. So I'm curious to understand kind of what is your framework, or can you share with our listeners today, Dr. Varsha, about your DE&I framework?
So, before I get into talking about the framework itself, I really want to speak about what went into creating this kind of framework. So, for us, finding a deeper sense of purpose, a sense of clarity of what D&I is what should really be the approach for organizations, right? So, keeping this in mind, we really constructed the framework. Like you mentioned earlier, every organization has a different take on it. Different, it depends on the location they are, the kind of situations they are in, and therefore, our framework should be something that everybody can relate to, can implement, right? So that is really the approach to our framework, and therefore, our framework should help navigate through fear, resistance, or even anger that can come up during a culture change. It's also important that the future of workplace not just be, hip on the surface, but really evolve from within. So our approach is really inclusion before diversity, but we'll get into that a bit later. We can elaborate more on that. But in a nutshell, it's a three-step process. Measure the current status, identify gaps, and fill those gaps. While these three steps look probably simple, it could also be a little overwhelming when you start putting it into practice. But without a deep dive into the mindset of people, I don't think it's really possible for any of the D&I initiatives to be successful. And these steps are really focused on assessing inclusion, identifying the gaps there, and filling those gaps. Right. So, our framework also includes a lot of tips and information about D&I at personal and professional levels. But really, at the core, we have assessments, like Rajeev was mentioning. Its measurement is really the key here. It provides a personal element to kickstart the D&I journey. Now, we know for a fact that organizations have pulse surveys. They have a lot of uh, you know uh, ways and means in which they collect information about the diversity and inclusion temperature or atmosphere at organizations. But what we really want is to measure how included people feel, how diverse they are cognitively or otherwise, because these are the points that would give us inputs and feed into a training program that can create a habit or practice of inclusion. Creating an inclusive mindset is really, I think, the first step for bringing in any kind of diversity and making that initiative a success. Our book speaks a lot about all of this. It has a lot of worksheets to get one started on the journey at both personal and professional levels. To give you an example, we have worksheets that people can use to assess how cognitively different they are. You know, there are worksheets that help you understand how differently you would handle conflicts from, your team members. And obviously we have our inclusion questionnaire, which will tell people how inclusive they are towards others and as well as how included they feel. We also have a few tips and information and resources for people to go by. So say for example, I want to be inclusive but I don't know how, right? So a key thing for me to do is to develop something called a cultural humility, even cognitive humility, which means I might be acquainted with someone's culture already, but every time I meet a new person, I keep my stereotypes and biases aside and listen and be open to this new person, right? And if uh, one is the one who's reading the book is already in the minority group, then uh, how do they find out the skills that make them diverse, and how do they really showcase that? And then, of course, we also speak about integrative leadership in our framework. Uh, and we also have a few key points for like tips that the leaders can start off, by being vulnerable, by, by being a great listener. I think leaders can not only, be open to diverse viewpoints, but can also create that psychological safety for their team. So our framework is a lot of these things. We have tips, we have assessments, we have worksheets, but at the core, like I said, it is something that is applicable and doable and actionable, um, in its true sense. So yeah, I think that's what I like to say about our framework.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha. That was fascinating, and it was a interesting way that you described your framework and how it can be used. And as we wrap up with our discussion today, Rajeev, can you kind of share your thoughts on diversity or inclusion, or the connection between them? What you find should come first?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that keeps coming up is people talk a lot about diversity, talk the entire focus on diversity. There isn't much on inclusion. In our opinion, very clearly, inclusion comes first. If you're not an inclusive person, if you don't have an inclusive culture in an organization, there is absolutely no way diversity can thrive. And it's very obvious, right? It's like if you want to if you want to get a forest in an arid area, you first need to irrigate the land and then put in the seeds. You can't just throw in the seeds and hope the forest will really grow. That's not going to happen. Inclusion is exactly like that. Also, inclusion is the more difficult part to do because as humans, we have our own biases. There is homophily where we are attracted to people, or we want to be with people of a particular type, of a particular stereotype, which is typically like us, and therefore trying to open ourselves to people that are not typical of us and that are atypical of us is difficult. If you have to do that, it has to be through a force of habit, it has to be through force of culture, and cultural change is not easy to do. There are multiple examples. I can talk of a very large multinational company that said that they had a very, very aggressive target of having 50% women in the organization within a particular period of time. They gave mandates to recruiters that they have to go and hire them no matter what. Recruiters did that without getting convinced, of course, that this is going to help in the overall cause of improving the business. But they reached the target of 50% women. What did they find after about 3 to 6 months is that the churn in the women employees was much higher. It was extremely high. People are dropping off. The all the promised stuff about innovation working better, etc., was not working. When they dug deep, they figured out that while they got the women in, they had not put in the steps to make the culture inclusive and welcoming of them. People continue to have water cooler conversations. People continue to point fingers, saying that you are in this organization only because you are a woman, and so on and so forth. And that led to them being distanced. And they did not participate. They just made up the numbers. That is when they introduced a program where they actually got women to got the entire set of employees to understand why diversity is important, what do women bring to the table, and they also work to empower the women and ensure that they were upskilled so they could meet their more erstwhile dominant colleagues on the table at the same level. So if you don't do that, if you don't build the culture of inclusion right from the time that someone steps into the company, if you don't build inclusion into every single conversation that you have, every single meeting that you have, if you don't display it constantly, if you don't have measures to kind of look at a non-inclusive behavior in a very negative kind of a way, you will have a situation where you might be able to get diverse people into the organization, but you will not get the outcomes that you're expecting. In fact, it could impact you in a negative way. So in our mind, very very clearly, inclusion comes as a first as a culture. It's unfortunate that we always talk about it as D&I. We believe it should be IND. Get inclusion first. Make people receptive to the fact that there are diverse thoughts and diverse people coming in, and then work on your diversity quotient, so that when people do come in with diverse thinking, they are accepted, they're welcomed, and to cohesively you are able to solve problems much much faster. So that's what that's our viewpoint as far as inclusion is concerned.
Well said. Thank you, Rajeev, and thank you, Dr. Varsha, for sharing your perspectives and for just kind of providing some insight and around this topic that is, it's very complex, and yeah, it also it's complex, but if we think about it, in a very in a simple way where we are making the best effort to be inclusive and to create actions around inclusivity and to also create to ensure there's accountability and that there's a strategy and that you're looking at all the different areas of how you bring on board people and how you develop them and how you advance them, and that you are focused on inclusion and also diversity, but not just diversity for the sake of diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people really want to make it simple, just read our book Apples and Oranges. It'll make life very simple in terms of implementing the right inclusion and diversity policy in your companies.
Thank you, Rajiv, and thank you, Dr. Varsha. Have a great day.
Thanks, Rachel. You too.